If you pay attention to politics at all, you know the feeling. The other side isn't just wrong, they're morally corrupt. Democrats think Republicans want to destroy democracy and the environment. Republicans think Democrats want to abolish traditional values and bankrupt the country. The gap between these two worlds has grown so wide that half the country can't imagine being friends with people from the other side anymore. Now, the thing is, the actual policy disagreements between Democrats and Republicans have always existed, but what's changed, and this is what makes current polarization so destructive, is that we've come to hate each other personally, not just disagree politically. We're more convinced than ever that the other party is immoral, hypocritical, and fundamentally un-American. This emotional animosity is what researchers call effective polarization, and it's the real reason and the real poison that our politics are so divisive right now. So, what can actually fix this? The answer is probably less satisfying than you'd hope. It's not one thing, and most solutions only work partially, but there are approaches that have real evidence behind them, and there are structural changes that could genuinely help, if we had the political will to implement them. Now, before we start jumping to solutions, it's worth understanding what drives polarization in the first place. And here's where it gets interesting. It's not just that Democrats and Republicans disagree on policy, it's that our political identities have become emotional, almost tribal. Research shows that effective polarization is driven primarily by partisan identity itself, not by actual policy disagreement. When you're a Democrat or a Republican, that identity becomes wrapped up in your sense of self, and when that happens, you start attributing the worst motives to the other side. Democrats and Republicans both assume that their own party is motivated by the love of their country, while the other side is motivated by pure malice. That's a massive misperception, but it shapes how we see everything. Now, this partisan sorting has gotten worse over time. In 2024, only 34% of Americans identify as moderate, a record low. Among Republicans, 77% identify as conservative. The middle has collapsed, and because politics increasingly shapes who we befriend, where we live, and what we watch, we end up in ideological echo chambers where we rarely hear genuine arguments from the other side. The two-party system itself makes this worse. With only two options, the parties have become increasingly dogmatic and internally uniform. There's less ideological overlap between them than there used to be, and certain structural features like gerrymandered districts and closed primaries create incentives for politicians to appeal to the base rather than the center. Now, media consumption plays a role too, though maybe not in the way you'd think. The conventional wisdom used to be the only biased media, consumers would put partisan loyalty over factual truth. But recent research shows that everyone, across education levels and the political spectrum, tends to put partisanship over truth when consuming news. If true information contradicts your political worldview, you're more likely to reject it than to accept false information that confirms your worldview. This gets worse the more you consume partisan media. Now, before I get to promising stuff, it's important to be honest about what research has found doesn't actually solve polarization, or at least not on its own. Correcting misperceptions is surprisingly ineffective. You'd think that if people have false beliefs about the other party, like thinking they all support political violence or want to overturn democracy, then simply fact-checking those beliefs would reduce hostility. But recent research suggests this mostly doesn't work. The problem is that people's perceptions of the other party are weakly held and highly unstable. They change month to month, so even when you correct a misperception, it doesn't stick, and the correction itself can backfire and actually reinforce hostility. The emotional attachment to the group matters more than the beliefs about it. Primary election reform is mixed at best. For decades, reformers have argued that close primaries with only partisan voters create incentives for extreme candidates. So the solution seems obvious. Open up primaries or try top two systems where all candidates compete in a first round and the top two advance regardless of party. In theory, this should push politicians toward the center, but the evidence is surprisingly murky. Some studies show modest effects. Others find little evidence that it matters. Alaska's experience is instructive here. They adopted a ranked choice voting system, which I'll get to in a moment, and while it did elect some more moderate candidates, voters nearly rejected the system again in 2024 by the razor's-thin margin of 50.1% to 49.9%. The polarization was so intense that even a system specifically designed to moderate the outcome faced fierce opposition. Before moving on, it's worth addressing a genuine counterargument. Some people argue that polarization itself isn't the real problem, that it's actually a symptom of something else, like genuine moral disagreement, or material inequality, or real threats to democracy. From this view, worrying about reducing polarization might actually be a way of avoiding the hard conversations we need to have. There's real merit to this argument. If one side is actually trying to, undermine democracy, and there's credible evidence of this, then demanding compromise and dialogue might seem naive or even dangerous. Why should you meet halfway with someone who won't accept democratic norms? Here's the thing though. The research suggests the problem isn't that one side is vastly more anti-democratic than the other. It's that both sides have elevated levels of anti-democratic sentiments. And both sides are convinced the other side is the real threat. That mutual conviction, even if partly based on real behavior, is a mechanism that is driving the crisis. When each side believes the other is an existential threat, people become willing to abandon democratic practices to defend themselves. You get a doom loop where defensive, anti-democratic measures prompt the other side to escalate in response. So yes, there are real disagreements. Yes, there are real threats. But the polarization, the emotional animosity, and the mutual conviction that the other side is fundamentally corrupt, that's what's actually preventing us from addressing those real problems through democratic means. You can't pass legislation if half the Congress won't work with the other half. You can't hold elections if significant portions of both parties don't believe in the results. The polarization isn't a distraction from the real issues. It's what makes it impossible to solve them. That said, this isn't an argument for both sidism or false equivalence. It's an argument that reducing emotional animosity, while still having fierce disagreements about values and policies, is actually necessary for democracy to function at all. Okay, so what does work? The honest answer is a combination of things, and most of them only work partially. Electoral system reforms have the strongest structural case. Ranked choice voting is the most talked about option. Here's how it works. Instead of voting for one candidate, you rank your choices in order. If your first choice is eliminated, your vote counts for your second choice. This sounds technical, but it actually changes candidate incentives dramatically. Candidates can't win by just appealing to their partisan base. They need to be the second choice of voters from the other party. That means they campaign differently. Negative attacks are less effective because you're trying to be appealing to people who don't love your party. Third-party candidates become viable because people can vote for them without wasting their vote. Alaska implemented RCV in 2022, and in their first election, they ended up with a moderate Republican senator, a moderate Democratic congresswoman, and a conservative Republican governor, showing it's not just moderate forcing, but party neutral. Importantly, they voted to keep the system in 2024, despite polarization-fueled opposition. It's not a magic bullet, but the evidence suggests it does push incentives in a more moderate direction. The other structural reform with real potential is independent redistricting commissions, basically taking the power to draw voting maps away from partisan politicians and giving it to independent commissions. Gerrymandering is honestly a huge part of why candidates feel secure appealing to the base. If you know your district is safe, you can afford to be extreme because you only face a challenge from within your party. But if independent commissions create more competitive districts, candidates suddenly have to appeal across the aisle. This doesn't fix polarization overnight, but it removes one major structural reinforcement of it. Cross-party dialogue is surprisingly effective, at least temporarily. This is where things get more people-focused. Research on intergroup contact theory suggests that when people from opposing groups actually talk to each other, not just about politics, but in a real deliberative setting, effective polarization drops. One study found that ordinary Democrats and Republicans brought together for structured political discussions showed substantial reductions in partisan animosity, and these effects persisted for at least a week after the conversation. That might sound like a small thing, but it's meaningful compared to most interventions. Citizens' assemblies take this a step further. There are basically jury duty for political deliberation. Randomly selected citizens are brought together with expert information, structured conversation, and actual time to think about difficult political questions. Ireland used them to address same-sex marriage and abortion restrictions, issues that had been completely off limits for politicians. France used one to find common ground on climate policy. The assembly format seems to work because it removes the performative, electoral incentive from the conversation. You're not trying to win a primary or appeal to your base. You're actually trying to think through a problem with people who see it differently. That fundamentally changes how people engage with each other. Media platform changes could help too, though this one is one area where the incentives are really working against solution finding. Platforms algorithmically amplify divisive content because it gets engagement. Outrage and negativity go viral, but research suggests that surfacing more examples of positive inter-party contact and dialogue in people's feeds could reduce polarization. The challenge is that this means less engagement, less ad revenue, and platforms have every incentive to keep the engagement high. But regulation, like the European Union's Digital Services Act, is starting to create pressure on platforms to take responsibility for their role in polarization. Here's the hard part. Even when individual interventions work, they work at small scale, and the effects often fade. One recent study found that even promising depolarization interventions produce only small shifts, about 5 points on a 101-point scale. And these effects decay rapidly, and that's in a controlled setting with people who've chosen to participate. The deeper issue is that individual behavior change and dialogue programs aren't enough without changing the structural incentives that make politicians want to inflame polarization in the first place. As one Carnegie research suggests, pluralism programs to bridge differences are not enough to improve democracy. Instead, interventions to change individuals' emotions must be paired with efforts that alter how politicians are incentivized to instrumentalize or amplify effective polarization as a strategy. In other words, even if you get half the country to have one dialogue session, it doesn't matter if politicians just keep stoking the division because it's politically profitable. This creates a catch. The reforms that could change those incentives, RCV, independent redistricting, and primary reform, require political action, but polarization makes political action harder. Parties that benefit from the current system won't vote to change it, and advocating hard for these reforms can actually backfire. Failure to achieve them can harden misperceptions and make people more cynical. Okay, one thing that research keeps finding is that leadership behavior matters enormously. When political leaders engage in divisive rhetoric and prioritize partisan interests over the common good, it worsens polarization. Conversely, when leaders call out extremism in their own party and try to model civility, it can shift norms. The problem is that in the current environment, there are strong incentives pulling leaders toward division. A Republican politician who tries to work with Democrats or acknowledge legitimate points from the other side risks primary challenges from the right. A Democrat who does the same risks the same from the left, so even well-intentioned leaders face structural pressure toward polarization. This suggests that any serious effort to depolarize has to involve a commitment from leaders in both parties to change the political incentives, to make compromise and civility viable and valuable again, rather than politically dangerous. That's easier said than done in a narrowly divided electorate where every vote counts. Given all this, what actually seems feasible? The honest truth is that depolarization is hard and slow. Historical analysis shows that when countries have successfully depolarized, about 60% of the time, they stay depolarized for at least a decade, but almost half eventually repolarize. It's not a permanent fix, it's an ongoing effort. Given the structural obstacles and the difficulty of change, incremental reform seems more realistic than comprehensive change. You're not going to flip the entire system overnight, but you could implement ranked choice voting in a state or two. You could create independent redistricting commissions in more states. You could fund citizens' assemblies in local communities. You could start media literacy programs. You could organize grassroots dialogue initiatives. These things don't solve polarization, but they shift incentives, create models that work, and show that change is possible. And small changes can compound. If enough states adopt RCV, it changes the national political dynamic. If enough communities do dialogue programs, it changes the culture. If enough media platforms reduce algorithmic amplification of divisiveness, it changes information flows. The key insight is that this isn't a problem with one solution. It's a problem with structural incentives, institutional design, media systems, and individual psychology all reinforcing each other. So the fix has to work on all those levels simultaneously. Reform electoral systems to reduce the pressure toward extremism, change how media platforms amplify content, support dialogue initiatives that rebuild trust, and cultivate leadership that models civility and calls out division. None of these alone are enough. Together, they might actually shift the dial. Now, what I think is often missing from discussions of depolarization is honesty about how hard this is. We're not just talking about people disagreeing, we're talking about a situation where major structural incentives push toward polarization, where emotional attachments to partisan identity are strong, where media systems amplify division, and where political leaders have every reason to lean into conflict. There's no silver bullet. There's no, if we just did X, polarization would fix itself. The solutions are multiple. They're partial. They take time, and they have to be sustained. And even then, there's a possibility of it still backsliding. But the fact that it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible. Countries have successfully depolarized before. Some states are experimenting with systems that seem to reduce the pressure toward extremism. Dialogue programs show real effects. The structures that created polarization were built by human choice, and human choices can rebuild them differently. The question isn't whether it's easy. The question is whether we're willing to put in the work and whether our leaders are willing to sacrifice the short-term advantage that comes from stoking division in order to preserve the long-term health of democracy. That's ultimately the real obstacle. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, and only if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps so much. Thank you for watching, and I really hope that you have a good day.